The hot sun beat down on the dusted roads of West Africa, and in the villages along the rivers life had its rhythm. Children playing, women tending crops, men working in iron forges and markets. Life was not easy, but it was theirs. Families lived together, stories were told around fires at night, and the land was familiar, holding the memory of generations. That world, rich and complex, was about to be shattered by forces far beyond their understanding. In the mid-1400s, European ships began appearing along the coast. Portuguese explorers came first, followed by the Dutch, English and French. At first the trade was in gold, ivory and spices, but soon the Europeans saw a new commodity: people. They wanted labor for the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, the tobacco fields in the Americas, and eventually the cotton lands of the southern colonies. It was a greed that did not care about families, culture or humanity. It started slowly in a way that might have seemed small at first. Traders offered goods, cloth, beads, knives and trinkets in exchange for captives from local conflicts. Chiefs and warlords seeking weapons or alliances sometimes handed over prisoners from rival villages. The people taken often thought they would be forced into servitude nearby, perhaps working for someone else for a few years. No one could imagine what awaited across the ocean. Then came the chains. Families were torn apart. Fathers were pulled from their homes as they tried to feed their children. Mothers screamed as children were yanked from their arms. Elders who had spent their lives tending fields and teaching traditions were beaten to submission. The air was filled with the sounds of despair, yet no one could stop the men in strange foreign clothes, armed with guns and swords, who demanded compliance. The journey to the coast was brutal. People were crammed into small wooden pens, sometimes for weeks, with little food or water. Illness spread quickly. Those too weak to walk were left behind or killed. Each step closer to the ships was a step further from everything familiar. The forests and rivers of home became distant memories, replaced by the endless horizon of the sea. When the captives were loaded onto the ships, the horrors intensified. The Middle Passage was a journey designed to crush both body and spirit. Men, women and children were chained together, stacked in the hold like cargo. The smell of sickness, sweat and human waste was suffocating. Many died before reaching the Americas. Disease, malnutrition and abuse claimed them. Some who survived whispered to themselves, holding on to the memory of home, clinging to the hope that life could continue on the other side. The ships themselves were instruments of cruelty. Overseers carried whips, sticks and chains, enforcing obedience with violence. Women were raped, men were beaten until they could barely stand. The captives learned quickly that any defiance could mean death, not just for themselves but for those near them. They whispered to one another, sharing small stories of resistance. A child refusing to eat, a woman hiding her baby to protect it, a man refusing to work when possible. Every act of courage was dangerous but kept their humanity alive. Months later, when the ships finally docked in the Americas, the captives were herded onto auction blocks. Families were torn apart again. A father might be sold to a plantation in Virginia, a mother to South Carolina, children scattered in different directions. The cries of mothers and children echoed through the wooden yards, ignored by buyers counting coins and slaves, seeing people only as property. The heartache of separation was endless. Some never saw their loved ones again. In the English colonies, laws began to take shape that made slavery permanent. A child born to an enslaved woman was automatically considered a slave. Skin color became the marker of bondage. Even free black people were vulnerable. Laws prohibited them from owning land or carrying weapons. Slavery became a system not just of labor but of control, designed to strip identity, to prevent rebellion, to make human beings into commodities. On the plantations, life was a constant struggle. Work began before sunrise, with fields of tobacco, rice or indigo stretching endlessly. Tools were crude and the overseers were brutal. Those who fell behind were whipped. Those who resisted were tortured, branded or executed in front of others to set an example. Men, women and children labored together, yet no one was free. At night, the exhausted enslaved would return to crude cabins where privacy was non-existent and rest was never complete. Hunger gnawed constantly and disease was rampant. Rape was a shadow over every plantation. Enslaved women had no control over their bodies. Owners, overseers and sometimes even other men in the community treated them as objects. Pregnancy was forced upon them, and children born from these assaults became slaves themselves. The pain, shame and trauma were passed down, yet the women found ways to survive. They whispered lullabies in the night, preserved fragments of their culture, and taught their children the importance of endurance. Amid this suffering, there was also resilience. People found ways to resist, quietly or openly. Some ran away, risking death to find freedom in the north or among sympathetic communities. Some sabotaged crops or tools, making work slower, asserting their agency in small but meaningful ways. Songs, stories and prayers became acts of survival, keeping memory and hope alive in a world designed to erase both. As the decades passed, the population of enslaved people grew. Natural reproduction and continued importation meant that slavery became embedded in the economy and culture of the southern colonies. Wealthy plantation owners thrived, building grand houses, while enslaved people built everything, labored endlessly and endured unimaginable cruelty. The system relied on total control, yet cracks appeared in the form of escape, rebellion and the persistence of human spirit. By the late 1700s, voices against slavery began to rise. Abolitionists, both black and white, spoke out, published pamphlets and helped people escape. The contradictions of liberty fighting for independence from Britain while keeping millions enslaved were impossible to ignore. Enslaved people themselves learned to read in secret, organized, prayed, and dreamed of freedom. The fight was beginning, though it would take decades of struggle, blood, and sacrifice to achieve real change. Slavery in America had started far from the shores of the English colonies, with greed, violence, and the demand for labor. It had transported millions of people from their homes, subjected them to the horrors of the Middle Passage, and forced them into a life of relentless labor, abuse, and dehumanization. Yet in the midst of this darkness, there were acts of courage, love, and resistance that refused to be extinguished. Families were broken, bodies were violated, and spirits were tested beyond imagination, but hope and resilience endured, planting the seeds for the eventual fight for freedom. The story of the beginning of slavery is not just a history of suffering, it is the story of the strength and endurance of those who survived, resisted, and preserved their humanity against unimaginable odds. This was the foundation upon which the rest of America's story would be built, a foundation of injustice that would take centuries to confront, and whose echoes are still felt today. The land in the English colonies stretched wide, fertile, and waiting to be worked. The first enslaved people had arrived, but the system was just beginning to take shape. As tobacco, rice, and indigo became profitable, plantation owners realized that they needed a labor force that could be controlled and forced to work long hours. Enslaved Africans were that labor. Over time, the colonies created laws, rules, and customs to ensure that slavery became permanent and that resistance was punished. On a sprawling tobacco plantation in Virginia, the morning began before sunrise. The overseer shouted through the fields as enslaved men bent over the soil, planting and tending the crops. Women carried baskets of seedlings, children pulled weeds and fetched water. The work was backbreaking, the sun merciless. Any pause, any mistake could mean a whipping. The sound of the whip cracking through the air became part of the rhythm of the day. Even when the hands were blistered and the backs sore, they kept moving because stopping meant pain or worse. Families were never safe. A mother might be forced to leave her children to work in another field or sent to the owner's house to clean, cook, or serve. Fathers were sold or sent to distant plantations. People lived in constant fear that they might be separated from the ones they loved. And yet, even in this terror, bonds formed. Families held on to each other whenever possible. Stories of home were whispered at night. Songs carried messages of hope and resistance. Every small act of care was an act of defiance against the system designed to erase their humanity. The laws of the colonies reflected this control. In Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina, children born to enslaved mothers were themselves considered slaves for life. White men were given total authority over enslaved people. Running away was a crime, teaching someone to read was forbidden, and any act of rebellion was punished harshly. Even free black people lived under constant suspicion and strict rules. The system was designed to crush spirit, to make people into property rather than human beings. Enslaved people were not allowed to own property or gather freely. Religious meetings were sometimes permitted, but even prayer could be monitored. Yet within these constraints, culture survived. People danced, sang, and maintained traditions passed down from Africa. They found ways to celebrate life in small moments, a hidden drum, a secret gathering, or a lullaby whispered to a child. These moments of humanity were precious, fragile, and dangerous. Rape was a constant shadow over enslaved women. Owners and overseers treated them as objects, their bodies controlled for labor, punishment, or sexual exploitation. Pregnancy often meant nothing more than creating another enslaved generation. The children born from these assaults were enslaved from birth, further entrenching the system. Women endured these horrors with courage, finding ways to nurture their children and preserve a sense of dignity even when everything around them demanded submission. Men, too, faced brutality. Physical punishment was routine. Whippings, beatings, and being chained in irons were daily threats. Many were forced to work in the fields from sunrise to sunset. Others labored in dangerous conditions, cutting trees, working with sharp tools, or tending livestock. Illness was common and medical care was minimal. Death was always near, yet survival was an act of resilience. Resistance took many forms. Some ran away, risking capture or death, hoping to find freedom in northern colonies, Spanish Florida, or Native American lands. Others sabotaged tools or crops, refusing to let their labor be fully productive. Quiet acts of defiance, hiding food, slowing the work, secretly teaching children to read allowed enslaved people to assert control over the little they could. Rebellion sometimes erupted into open revolt, but these were met with extreme violence and served as warnings to others. The growing economy of slavery drew more enslaved people to the colonies. Traders brought Africans from different regions, often unfamiliar with each other's languages and cultures, making communication and unity more difficult. Yet they adapted. New communities formed, blending customs, foods, and beliefs from different African regions, creating something new while holding on to fragments of the old world. In the northern colonies, slavery existed too, though differently. Enslaved people worked in households, docks, and shops. They cooked, cleaned, built homes, and labored alongside craftsmen. They faced harsh punishment and limited freedom, but the scale and brutality of plantations were more extreme in the South. Northern slavery was still a system of oppression. Yet it sometimes allowed for slightly more interaction with free communities and in some cases escape opportunities. Trade networks also fueled the system. Ports like Charleston, Savannah, and New York became hubs for the buying and selling of enslaved people. Ships arrived constantly, bringing fresh labor to feed the growing plantations. Auctions were public spectacles, families were torn apart, children cried for their mothers, husbands for their wives. The owners counted coins, not lives. Each sale reinforced the power dynamic, teaching enslaved people that resistance could be deadly but survival was essential. Life on the plantations was structured to break spirit. From dawn to dusk there was work, punishment was swift, meals were minimal, sleep was crowded and uncomfortable. But even in this harshness, humanity persisted. Elders taught children in secret. Stories of Africa, songs, prayers, and rituals survived. People helped each other, shared food when possible, and held hands through despair. These small acts were the threads that kept them connected to each other and to a sense of self. Enslaved people also learned about the world beyond the plantations. News from ships, travelers, and traders sometimes brought information about rebellion, abolition, or freedom in far-off places. Stories of those who escaped or of revolts circulated quietly, giving hope and courage. These stories reminded them that the system was not invincible, and that courage could exist even in the face of overwhelming oppression. As the 1700s progressed, slavery became increasingly entrenched in the colony's economy and society. Wealthy families built mansions, grew their fortunes, and relied entirely on the labor of enslaved people. The contrast between the lives of the enslavers and the enslaved was stark. The system depended on complete control, yet cracks in that control appeared in small acts of defiance, in cultural survival, and in the ever-present desire for freedom. This period was also marked by increasing regulation. Laws prohibited marriage between enslaved people, restricted gatherings, and codified racial distinctions. Enslaved people had no legal protection, while white colonists' property rights were paramount. The legal system was a weapon, enforcing obedience and embedding slavery into the structure of society. Despite this, enslaved communities endured. Music, dance, oral traditions, and spiritual practices became lifelines. They communicated through song, hidden messages, and storytelling. They preserved memory and culture even under constant threat. Children learned from elders, absorbing lessons in survival, resistance, and hope. Love and solidarity persisted even when families were threatened, and these bonds strengthened the resolve to survive and resist. By the mid-1700s, slavery was no longer just a labor system. It was a culture of control, punishment, and terror. Plantations stretched across the South. Laws codified cruelty. Families were shattered. Yet at the same time, enslaved people nurtured life in impossible circumstances. They survived beatings, hunger, and sexual violence. They resisted where they could, escaped when they could, and preserved their humanity when everything tried to take it from them. The growth of slavery in America laid the foundation for a society built on exploitation. It was a world where human beings were property, where every aspect of life was controlled, and where the threat of violence shaped every decision. And yet it was also a world where courage, resilience, and the human spirit continued to shine. The people who endured it were not merely victims, they were survivors, storytellers, teachers, and fighters, keeping alive a hope for freedom that would one day lead to a nation's reckoning. The journey began long before the ocean ever appeared. In villages across West and Central Africa, families lived their lives with customs, work, and traditions passed down for generations. Children ran through the fields, women sang as they cooked, and elders told stories of ancestors. But that life was fragile, and the arrival of European traders disrupted it forever. At first, the traders came with goods, cloth, beads, metal tools, and weapons. Chiefs and local leaders accepted these items in exchange for prisoners from wars or raids. For the captives, it often began as confusion. They might have thought they were being sent to work temporarily for another village. No one could imagine the horror that awaited across the Atlantic. When they were captured, families were torn apart immediately. Men, women, and children were separated. Mothers cried out for their children. Fathers begged for mercy. Elders tried to shield the youngest, but the men with guns and swords showed no hesitation. Those who resisted were beaten or killed. The captives were forced to march long distances to the coast, often in chains under the hot sun. Hunger, thirst, and exhaustion claimed many before they even reached the ships. At the coast, large wooden ships waited, their holds dark and stinking. People were packed below decks like cargo, chained together, lying in their own waste. The air was thick and suffocating. Disease spread quickly. Smallpox, dysentery, and fever claimed lives daily. Many died before the journey even began. The Middle Passage was unlike anything the captives had experienced. For weeks, sometimes months, they endured the ocean's cruelty. Storms tossed the ships, waves swept through the decks, and the smell below was unbearable. People were chained side by side, unable to move freely, their bodies pressed together in the darkness. Some became so sick they could not rise. Others were beaten to force them to comply. The sound of crying, coughing, and moaning became constant. Women were especially vulnerable. Sexual abuse by crew members was common, and there was no protection. Pregnant women gave birth in the hold, often without assistance, and infants struggled to survive. Families could be broken again in this confined space as children died or were taken away. The captives clung to memories of home and whispered prayers, trying to maintain a sense of identity in a place designed to erase it. Every day was a battle for survival. Food was meager, water often contaminated. Men, women, and children became weak from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. Some tried to resist by refusing to eat or moving too slowly, but punishment was swift. Those who died were thrown overboard, disappearing into the endless ocean, leaving others to wonder if they too would vanish before reaching the shore. Despite the horrors, small acts of courage persisted. People helped each other in secret, sharing what little food they had, comforting the sick, and whispering songs from home. Elders passed on traditions, taught children words in their native languages, and reminded everyone that they were still human. These moments of solidarity were vital for survival. After weeks or months, the ships finally reached the Americas. The landing was another nightmare. People were taken to ports, forced onto small boats, and brought to auction houses. Families, if they had survived together, were separated again. Children were sold apart from parents, husbands and wives torn apart. The cries of those left behind filled the air, but buyers only counted coins. Humanity was invisible to those who treated people as property. The auction blocks were public spectacles. Enslaved people were examined, prodded, and displayed. They were forced to dance or lift their arms to show physical strength. Buyers checked teeth, muscles, and hands. Women were inspected for fertility. The dehumanization was complete. Those who resisted even slightly were beaten or chained. Families were scattered across plantations, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. The system was designed to maximize profit and crush spirit. Laws in the colonies codified slavery, making it lifelong and hereditary. Children of enslaved women became slaves automatically. White colonists had total authority. Punishments were severe: whippings, branding, mutilation, or death. Yet even in the face of constant terror, people resisted in whatever ways they could. Once on plantations, enslaved people faced relentless work. Fields of sugar, tobacco, rice, and later cotton stretched endlessly. Men, women, and children labored from sunrise to sunset. Tools were crude, work was dangerous, and the overseers carried whips, ready to punish any perceived laziness. Hunger, illness, and exhaustion were constant companions. Rape remained a horrifying reality. Women were exploited by owners and overseers. Children born from these assaults were enslaved from birth, perpetuating the cycle. The trauma was passed from one generation to the next, yet women found ways to protect their children, teach them survival, and preserve fragments of culture. Resistance took many forms. Some attempted to escape, seeking freedom in the North, Spanish territories, or among Native American communities. Others slowed work, broke tools, or secretly taught one another to read and write. Rebellion was rare because the punishments were extreme, but stories of revolt inspired courage and solidarity. Even as the slave trade continued for centuries, enslaved people preserved culture and identity. Songs, dances, and stories passed down the coast of Africa were adapted in the Americas. Communities formed among enslaved people from different regions, creating new traditions while keeping old ones alive. Religion, music, and family, though under constant threat, became tools of resistance and survival. The trade itself was relentless. Ports in Charleston, Savannah, and New York thrived on the commerce of enslaved people. Ships arrived regularly, bringing new captives to replace those who died or were too old to work. Each arrival meant more broken families, more labor for plantations, and more profit for owners. The economy depended on human suffering, and the law and society supported it. Through it all, enslaved people endured. They survived sickness, beatings, rape, and starvation. They resisted quietly and openly. They preserved culture and identity in a system built to erase both. The Middle Passage and the slave trade were not just journeys across the ocean, they were the beginning of a life in chains, where every day was a struggle to survive, remember, and maintain humanity. This chapter in history was one of the darkest, yet it also revealed the strength of the human spirit. Even in the depths of cruelty, people held on to hope, nurtured one another, and prepared for the future when freedom might be possible. The legacy of the slave trade would shape America for centuries, leaving scars that would take generations to heal, but also stories of resilience that would inspire those who followed. The morning sun rose over the vast fields of the southern colonies, casting long shadows over rows of crops that stretched as far as the eye could see. The day began not with birdsong or laughter, but with the harsh calls of overseers, the snapping of whips, and the groans of bodies forced into labor. Men bent to the earth, planting tobacco, hoeing cotton, or tending rice paddies. Women carried baskets heavy with seedlings, cooked over fires for those working the fields, or labored in the owner's house. Children, too small for the heaviest work, were put to tasks that kept them close but still demanded effort, fetching water, carrying bundles, tending livestock. Every minute was a struggle for survival. The work itself was relentless. There was no rest beyond a short meal, usually a thin porridge or stale bread. The sun blazed, sweat stung eyes, and the soil was unyielding. Tools were crude, injuries were common. Cuts and burns often became infected. Anyone who slowed or faltered was met with the whip or the rod. Some men were chained together while working, unable to escape punishment. Every act of resistance, whether deliberate or subtle, carried the threat of severe consequences. Punishment was not only physical but psychological. Public whippings were common, designed to instill fear and obedience in others. Families watched in terror as a father, mother, or child was lashed for minor infractions. Some were branded with hot irons, their pain a warning to the rest. Those who attempted escape were hunted, captured, and punished brutally, sometimes killed to set an example. Life was carefully structured to break the spirit, to teach that resistance was dangerous and compliance was survival. Rape was a shadow that lingered over every plantation. Women had no control over their bodies. Owners and overseers could claim them at will. Pregnancy meant not joy, but a continuation of bondage. The child born would be a slave, part of the property of the owner. The trauma was immense, yet women found ways to survive. They whispered songs to their children, taught them traditions and stories of resilience, and clung to whatever fragments of identity they could preserve. Men, too, faced humiliation and violence, sometimes being forced to witness or endure the exploitation of loved ones. The horrors were unending, but survival demanded endurance. Families were constantly under threat. Husbands, wives, mothers, and children could be sold away at any moment. The auction block loomed as a constant terror in daily life. Bonds were formed despite this uncertainty, with neighbors and friends creating surrogate families to offer support. Elders taught children to read in secret, to remember the stories of Africa, and to preserve songs and prayers that connected them to a distant homeland. Every small act of love was defiance, a reminder that they were still human. Even amidst terror, culture endured. Music became a tool for survival and resistance. Work songs carried rhythms that made the labor bearable, and some contained hidden messages about escape or solidarity. Dance and ritual preserved African traditions, sometimes blending with Christian elements forced upon them. Storytelling allowed lessons and history to survive from one generation to the next. Religion, whether imposed or adapted, provided solace and hope. Resistance took many forms. Some ran, risking death to reach freedom. Others quietly sabotaged work, breaking tools, destroying crops, or slowing production. Some communicated secretly, sharing knowledge about escape routes or hiding places. These acts were dangerous, yet they were essential to maintain dignity and autonomy. Even small victories, like teaching a child to read in secret or sharing hidden food, were profound acts of defiance. Daily life was also shaped by hierarchy among enslaved people. Older, experienced individuals often guided younger ones, teaching survival skills and ways to navigate punishment. Sometimes grudges and jealousy arose, often instigated by owners who sought to divide and control. But in general, community bonds were vital, offering protection, emotional support, and the continuity of culture. Health was precarious. Disease spread quickly in the cramped quarters of slave cabins. Malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses claimed many lives. Medical care was minimal and often cruel. People relied on traditional remedies when possible, sharing knowledge of herbs and treatments. Even in sickness, the work rarely ceased. Plantation owners demanded output regardless of suffering, further emphasizing the dehumanizing control of slavery. Enslaved children grew up learning labor early. Boys mimicked men, tending fields or working with tools. Girls assisted women in household or field tasks, learning skills that were necessary for survival. Education, when available, was often forbidden or secret. Teaching reading and writing was illegal in many colonies, yet some managed to pass knowledge quietly, understanding that literacy was a key to resistance and hope. Despite the brutality, there were moments of joy and humanity. Festivals, dances, and communal gatherings allowed enslaved people to celebrate life. Even small moments like shared meals or whispered songs at night preserved dignity. Elders told stories of African ancestors, heroes, and past glories, reminding everyone that they carried a legacy beyond the plantations. Rebellion was rare but significant. Stories of uprisings traveled quietly, inspiring courage. The Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739, for example, showed the lengths people would go to fight for freedom, even knowing the potential cost. Others escaped via hidden paths or the beginnings of networks that would later become the Underground Railroad. These acts of courage were dangerous, but demonstrated that the human spirit could not be fully contained. Work varied by region and crop. In rice plantations, men labored in flooded fields, battling water snakes and disease. Tobacco and cotton required long days bending and planting. Women often carried out both field and domestic work, increasing their burden. Every person contributed to the wealth of owners, yet they themselves lived with scarcity, hunger, and constant threat. Food and shelter were minimal. Cabins were small, overcrowded, and poorly constructed. Diets were basic cornmeal, greens, and occasional meat. Malnutrition weakened the body, making work harder and punishment more dangerous. Every day was a careful balance between survival and resistance, between enduring cruelty and finding moments of hope. The system depended on control and fear, but enslaved people found ways to assert autonomy. Secret marriages, hidden gatherings, and quiet rebellions allowed them to preserve some sense of freedom. Knowledge was shared discreetly, paths through forests, locations of sympathetic neighbors, and methods of survival. Even when surrounded by oppression, people found ways to maintain identity, community, and memory. By the late 1700s, the culture of slavery had grown deeply embedded. Plantations were sprawling and brutal. The legal system reinforced ownership and punished defiance. Families lived in fear, yet they persisted. Music, dance, prayer, and storytelling preserved a sense of self. Children learned lessons in survival and hope. Acts of resistance, small and large, kept alive the idea that freedom was possible even when it seemed out of reach. Life as a slave was not only work and punishment. It was endurance, courage, and humanity in the face of unimaginable cruelty. People endured sexual violence, family separations, hunger, disease, and relentless labor. They resisted where possible, nurtured their children, and preserved culture. They were survivors, and their resilience laid the foundation for the fight for freedom that would come generations later. Even under the constant weight of oppression, they dreamed, sang, prayed, and plotted escape. Their lives were defined by both suffering and strength, a testament to human endurance. In the cruelty of slavery, they found ways to survive, to love, and to resist, a story of courage that would echo across generations and shape the history of America itself. The colonies were restless. By the mid-1700s, tension with Britain had grown. Taxes, trade restrictions, and demands from the crown angered colonists, who began to talk of liberty, independence, and the rights of men. The air was full of speeches, pamphlets, and rallies. But this talk of freedom carried a bitter irony. Millions of people in the colonies were enslaved, denied liberty, and forced into lives of endless labor and brutality. On a Virginia plantation, enslaved men and women heard the distant drumbeats of rebellion. They knew the words, "All men are created equal." But they also knew that these words did not apply to them. Fathers still labored in the fields from dawn to dusk, mothers carried heavy loads, and children learned the rules of survival under the watchful eyes of overseers. The promises of freedom rang hollow. Some enslaved people saw opportunity in the upheaval. When the British offered freedom to enslaved people who fled their American masters to join the Crown's forces, many took the risk. Families were separated as men, women, and children ran toward the possibility of liberation, sometimes to join British lines, sometimes to find hiding places in the forests or northern colonies. Others remained, unwilling or unable to risk the uncertain promise of freedom. Daily life on the plantations continued under the same harsh rules. Work did not stop for rebellion, for news, or for hope. The overseers enforced labor with whips and chains. Women faced sexual abuse, men endured back-breaking work, and children learned to navigate the constant threat of punishment. Yet within these brutal routines, people discussed the events around them, sharing news about battles, troop movements, and rumors of freedom. For many, the revolution brought a mix of fear and hope. Some slaves hoped the American fight for independence might someday apply to them. Others saw it as a chance to negotiate better conditions, escape, or support their owners to gain favor. They learned that political promises were often empty, but the changing world created openings that had not existed before. In the cities, enslaved people were sometimes pressed into service by both sides. They carried supplies, cooked, repaired weapons, and labored for armies. Some men became soldiers fighting for a promise of freedom. Others were forced into work under threat of death. Through all of it, enslaved people found ways to resist stealing supplies, sabotaging equipment, or quietly escaping. Each act of defiance was dangerous but vital to maintain a sense of agency. Families continued to endure unimaginable strain. Parents whispered plans to protect their children, hid them from owners, and taught them survival skills. Elders told stories of Africa, of ancestors who had faced hardship and survived, reminding younger generations that their identity could not be taken. Music and song carried messages of hope and coded information about escape. In these moments, enslaved people claimed what freedom they could, even in tiny ways. The revolution also highlighted the contradictions of liberty. White leaders argued for freedom from British tyranny, yet they depended entirely on the labor of enslaved Africans. Laws and customs still treated black people as property. The rhetoric of the revolution created tension. Some whites argued for abolition, while others doubled down on slavery to protect economic interests. Enslaved people keenly understood these contradictions and sometimes used them to their advantage. Some ran to fight for the British, hoping for emancipation. Others joined patriots, sometimes in secret, sometimes openly, often without the promised rewards. Many were betrayed, returned to bondage, or abandoned after the fighting ended. Yet each attempt to claim freedom was an assertion of humanity, a refusal to accept the chains imposed upon them. On plantations, the revolution sometimes brought chaos that could be exploited. Fields went untended when owners left to fight. Guards were distracted by news or troop movements. Enslaved people took these moments to escape, hide, or resist in small ways. Sabotage became common, tools disappeared, animals were let loose, crops were damaged. Every act of defiance was dangerous yet necessary for survival and dignity. Religion played a complex role during this time. Some enslaved people attended sermons that reinforced obedience, while others used faith to sustain hope and courage. Songs, hymns, and prayers became lifelines, reminders of human worth in a system that sought to erase it. Communities persisted, nurturing one another spiritually, emotionally, and physically. By the end of the revolution, the landscape of slavery was largely unchanged in the South. Northern colonies began gradual emancipation, but the Southern economy depended on enslaved labor more than ever. Cotton, rice, and tobacco plantations grew, and the system became increasingly rigid. Families remained vulnerable to separation, women continued to endure sexual abuse, and men faced relentless labor and punishment. The promises of freedom that had floated on revolutionary rhetoric largely bypassed enslaved people, yet the revolution planted seeds of hope. The stories of those who escaped, fought, or resisted spread quietly, inspiring others. Abolitionist thought gained strength in some northern states. Enslaved people began to organize more, pass knowledge in secret, and develop networks that would later become critical in the fight for emancipation. The idea that freedom was possible, even if distant, began to take root. The contradictions of liberty during the revolution shaped the future struggle. The fight for independence revealed that America's ideals were incomplete and unjust. Enslaved people lived those contradictions every day, hearing promises of equality while enduring violence, exploitation, and dehumanization. And yet they survived, resisted, and preserved hope. By the war's end, some enslaved people had gained freedom through military service, escape, or manumission, but millions remained in bondage. The revolution demonstrated both the fragility and the power of human courage under oppression. It was a reminder that liberty was not guaranteed, but something to be claimed and defended, often at great risk. As the new nation took shape, slavery remained entrenched. The Constitution protected the institution indirectly, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation while denying them rights. State laws codified harsh conditions. Families remained vulnerable, labor was relentless, and sexual abuse continued. Life for the enslaved was still brutal, yet they had learned to navigate, resist, and preserve culture under impossible circumstances. The revolution was not the end of slavery, it was a moment that highlighted both its cruelty and the unbroken will of those enslaved. Men, women, and children endured whippings, hunger, forced labor, and family separation, but they survived, resisted, and maintained their humanity. They carried forward the hope that one day freedom might be fully realized, planting the seeds for the next generations to continue the fight. The story of slavery during the American Revolution is one of courage in the face of impossible odds. It is a story of endurance, of families striving to stay together, of culture preserved in secret, of hope maintained despite despair. The revolution revealed both the injustice of the system and the extraordinary resilience of those who lived within it, a resilience that would eventually fuel the struggle for emancipation and civil rights in the centuries to come. The southern landscape stretched endlessly, a patchwork of fields, forests, and rivers. By the early 1800s, cotton had become king. Its fibers were in demand across the world, fueling mills in England and the northern United States. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney transformed the crop from a labor-intensive nuisance into a highly profitable enterprise. Planters rejoiced, but for enslaved people, it meant even longer hours, harsher work, and deeper entrenchment of the system. On a sprawling plantation in Georgia, men bent over the cotton rows from dawn until dusk. The gin allowed the same fields to produce much more cotton than before, and the owners demanded the extra output. Sweat dripped from brows, backs ached, and blisters tore at hands, but the overseers were relentless. Whips cracked and shouts carried across the fields, warning that any slowing of work would be punished. Women carried baskets, plucked bowls, and returned to the gin repeatedly, while children helped in small but essential ways, carrying water, feeding animals, or gathering cotton that had fallen to the ground. The domestic slave trade expanded rapidly to supply the growing cotton economy. Traders moved enslaved people from the upper south to the deep south. Families were separated routinely. A father might be sold to Mississippi, a mother to Alabama, children scattered across hundreds of miles. Children cried out, parents screamed in despair, and the traders only counted the price. Men were forced to march long distances, sometimes hundreds of miles, chained and beaten if they faltered. Women were subjected to sexual abuse during transport, and pregnancies did not slow the journey. The trauma of separation and forced relocation became a daily reality. On the plantations, the work was grueling. Cotton had to be planted, tended, and picked with care. Each boll had to be harvested at the right time to ensure maximum profit. Children worked in the fields beside adults, learning the rhythm of labor that would shape their lives. The overseers demanded absolute obedience, using whips, chains, and even dogs to control the workforce. Any resistance, refusal to work, slowing down, or escaping was met with punishment, sometimes death. Life in the cabins offered little relief. Families crammed into small, poorly built structures, often sharing one room for sleeping, cooking, and living. Food was minimal: cornmeal, greens, occasional meat or fish. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making labor harder and punishment more dangerous. Disease spread easily in such conditions, yet even here enslaved people found ways to survive. Mothers sang lullabies, whispered stories, and preserved memories of Africa. Elders taught skills, passed down knowledge, and kept culture alive. Rape continued as a daily reality for women. Owners and overseers claimed their bodies, and children born from these assaults were enslaved automatically. The trauma was constant, yet women found ways to care for their children, protect them where possible, and preserve a sense of self. Men, too, endured the humiliation of having no control over their families and being forced to labor under extreme conditions. Sexual violence was part of the terror that reinforced the power of the owners and the system itself. Resistance took many forms. Some ran, risking capture or death, hoping to reach free territories in the north, swamps or native lands. Others slowed work, hid tools or sabotaged crops. Knowledge of the land, rivers and forests allowed some to escape or survive longer journeys. Religion, music and storytelling carried coded messages, taught strategies and maintained morale. Even in the darkest conditions, enslaved people found ways to assert control over their lives. The domestic trade became a powerful economic engine. Cities like New Orleans, Charleston and Mobile thrived as markets for enslaved people. Auctions displayed men, women and children, sometimes forcing them to dance or lift their arms to show physical strength. Families were ripped apart and traders profited from every separation. Children cried for parents, siblings were torn apart, and the enslaved were reminded constantly of their lack of control. The economic boom of cotton depended entirely on human suffering. Plantation owners grew wealthy and built lavish homes, while enslaved people built everything, labored endlessly, and endured unimaginable cruelty. The wealth of the South rested on enslaved bodies, yet laws and society were structured to make resistance dangerous. Teaching someone to read was forbidden. Gathering in groups was prohibited. Punishments were designed to terrorize, reinforcing obedience and submission. Cultural life persisted despite oppression. Music and dance preserved African traditions. Songs carried stories, news, and messages of hope. Elders taught children survival skills and history. Religion, though often adapted from what was imposed by owners, became a tool for endurance. Community bonds were essential, offering emotional and practical support in a world designed to strip humanity away. Families, though constantly at risk of separation, clung together. Parents protected children, shared what little food was available, and passed down knowledge quietly. Even in the face of constant trauma, these bonds provided strength, stability, and hope. Acts of love became forms of resistance, defying the system that sought to reduce people to property. Escape remained a dangerous but vital option. Some found paths to freedom in the north or in Spanish territories. Others hid for months in forests or swamps. News of successful escape spread quietly, inspiring others. These stories reinforced the idea that freedom was possible, even in a world built to prevent it. By the 1820s and 1830s, the Cotton Kingdom had become deeply entrenched. Slavery expanded westward with new territories, fueled by the invention of the cotton gin and global demand. Laws protected owners' rights, ensured harsh punishments, and criminalized resistance. The culture of control, fear, and brutality was absolute, yet the spirit of enslaved people persisted. They continued to resist, survive, and preserve their humanity. The domestic slave trade, expansion of cotton, and growing wealth of the South deepened the divide in America. Northern states were gradually abolishing slavery, while the South became increasingly dependent on it. The economic and social systems were intertwined with oppression. Families remained vulnerable, women continued to endure sexual violence, men faced unrelenting labor, and children grew up in a world of fear and exploitation. Even in this darkness, courage and resilience thrived. Stories, songs, and traditions survived. Secret teaching, cultural preservation, and small acts of rebellion sustained hope. Enslaved people endured unimaginable cruelty but maintained humanity. Their strength, resilience, and desire for freedom would fuel future rebellions and the eventual abolitionist movement. The Cotton Kingdom represented both the wealth of a few and the suffering of millions. It showed how deeply slavery was embedded in the economy and society, and how resilient those enslaved could be. Despite relentless labor, abuse, and family separations, people survived, resisted, and nurtured hope for a future when freedom might be possible. The night was dark, the moon a thin crescent over the dense forests of the South. In hidden corners of plantations, whispers traveled from one cabin to another. Enslaved people spoke quietly about escape, rebellion, and the dream of freedom. Even in the most brutal circumstances, resistance endured. It came in small acts like hiding food or slowing work, and in bold ones like organized revolts. Courage and defiance were woven into daily life. One of the earliest larger-scale rebellions occurred in South Carolina in 1739. Known as the Stoner Rebellion, it began with a group of men breaking free from the fields, armed with stolen weapons, determined to fight for their freedom. They moved through the countryside, gathering others along the way. Women and children followed when possible, carrying whatever belongings they could. Though the uprising was violently suppressed, the message was clear. Enslaved people would not accept bondage without struggle. Stories of such acts spread quietly, inspiring hope in communities across the South. Resistance was not always open or violent. Many enslaved people practiced everyday forms of defiance. Men would damage tools, slow their work, or pretend to be sick. Women sometimes hid their children or whispered lessons about survival and escape. Elders told stories of Africa, of heroes who fought oppression, passing wisdom and courage to the young. Music carried hidden meanings. Songs that seemed to be about planting or harvesting could encode directions, warnings, or encouragement. Every small act of resistance was a statement. Humanity could not be erased. The abolitionist movement gained strength in the North and among free black communities. Men and women spoke out against slavery, wrote pamphlets, delivered speeches, and organized networks to help those escaping. Figures like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison, and Harriet Beecher Stowe brought the horrors of slavery into public consciousness. They used words as weapons, exposing the cruelty of the system and appealing to the morality of the nation. The Underground Railroad became a lifeline for many seeking freedom. It was neither underground nor a railroad, but a vast network of safe houses, secret routes, and brave allies willing to risk their lives. Enslaved people learned of these paths through whispers, coded messages, and trusted neighbors. Those who escaped faced enormous danger: patrols, hunters, dogs, and the threat of capture. Yet the promise of freedom drove them forward. Families were often separated, and success could mean months or years of peril, but the courage to pursue liberty was unstoppable. In the Caribbean and South America, news of revolts reached the American colonies. Enslaved people shared stories of the Haitian Revolution, where men and women rose against oppression and claimed freedom for themselves. These stories traveled quietly, carried in song, word of mouth, or during secret gatherings. They inspired those in America to believe that freedom, though difficult, was possible. Even in regions where rebellions were crushed, enslaved people found ways to maintain dignity. Women raised children with lessons about survival, courage, and identity. Men taught young boys skills and knowledge that could help them endure or escape. Elders preserved history and tradition, reminding everyone that their roots and culture could not be destroyed by chains. Acts of defiance, small or large, kept hope alive and reinforced the idea that oppression was not permanent. Religious gatherings, sometimes permitted by owners, became spaces of subtle resistance. Preachers and spiritual leaders wove messages of hope and liberation into sermons. Songs and hymns, taught in secret or sung openly, offered coded guidance. People found strength in faith, believing that freedom might come, whether in this life or another. Spiritual resilience was as powerful as any weapon against slavery. The domestic slave trade continued to fuel resistance. People were sold to distant plantations, families torn apart, and communities fractured. These forced migrations created opportunities for escape and networking. People who survived the brutal journey often shared information, hid newcomers, and established trust in new places. The movement of enslaved people, though traumatic, inadvertently helped create a connected resistance network. Women played a critical role in resistance. They preserved culture, taught children, and protected one another. They organized clandestine gatherings, shared medicinal knowledge, and passed along messages about escape. Their courage was quiet but profound, shaping the survival of families and communities. Men, similarly, risked their lives in rebellion, labor slowdowns, and escapes. Every act, whether public or hidden, was part of a larger struggle for freedom. Rebellion was also fueled by education. Some enslaved people learned to read and write in secret, understanding that literacy could be a powerful tool. Knowledge of the world, the law, and the broader society gave them the means to resist, communicate, and navigate the dangers of slavery. Teaching one another became a form of defiance. Every word learned was a step toward reclaiming autonomy. Escape stories spread like wildfire, even when incomplete or perilous. People shared accounts of reaching free states, hiding in swamps, or finding allies in sympathetic communities. Each successful journey inspired others to attempt the same. Even when capture or punishment followed, these narratives reinforced courage, planning, and determination. They showed that resistance, though risky, could succeed. Abolitionists in the North worked tirelessly to support enslaved people. They petitioned governments, published newspapers, and provided safe havens. White and black allies collaborated in dangerous work, risking fines, imprisonment, or violence. Every act of support strengthened the network of resistance and brought hope to those still in bondage. As the 1800s progressed, resistance became more organized. Communities of free and enslaved black people developed communication networks. Coded language, secret signs, and trusted messengers allowed information to flow. These networks were essential for planning escapes, avoiding capture, and maintaining morale. They demonstrated that resistance was not just spontaneous but deliberate, strategic, and resilient. Revolts like Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831 shook the South to its core. Turner and his followers rose against oppression, taking up arms to fight for freedom. Though brutally suppressed, the rebellion terrified slaveholders and inspired hope among enslaved people. It showed that courage could overcome fear, even temporarily, and that oppression was never absolute. News of such uprisings traveled, quietly spreading inspiration. Resistance was also moral and intellectual. Enslaved people challenged the justifications for slavery through knowledge, faith, and culture. They preserved African traditions, adapted new skills, and nurtured intellectual curiosity. These acts reinforced identity and humanity in a system that sought to strip both away. By the 1840s and 1850s, the Underground Railroad was more organized than ever. People like Harriet Tubman risked their lives repeatedly, leading dozens of enslaved people to freedom. Networks spanned states, connecting farms, churches, and cities. Communities collaborated across racial lines, defying laws like the Fugitive Slave Act. Every escape was a triumph of courage, trust, and planning. Even when captured, enslaved people resisted in prison, during transport, and on auction blocks. They sang to maintain morale, refused to comply silently, and sometimes fought back. Resistance was pervasive, woven into every aspect of life. from labor to clandestine education, from storytelling to escape. It demonstrated the unbreakable will to survive and claim freedom. By the eve of the Civil War, resistance had become a defining feature of enslaved life. Rebellions, escapes, secret education, cultural preservation, and abolitionist efforts combined to challenge the system. Despite brutal oppression, enslaved people maintained identity, community, and hope. Their courage laid the groundwork for the eventual struggle for emancipation. The story of resistance is not one of simple triumph. Families were lost, lives were destroyed, and freedom was often fleeting. But the persistence of courage, hope, and humanity amid unimaginable cruelty is a testament to the strength of those who endured. Every song, story, and escape attempt was a statement. Enslaved people would not accept oppression as their fate. By the 1850s, America was divided like never before. The North and South were drifting toward war, their differences shaped largely by the question of slavery. In the South, the economy relied on enslaved labor to produce cotton, rice, and tobacco. Plantations stretched across states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, where enslaved people labored under brutal conditions. In the North, industry and trade dominated, and most states had abolished slavery. The tension between these two worlds grew more intense with each passing year. On a plantation in Mississippi, enslaved families heard news from travelers, newspapers, and word of mouth. Tales of abolitionist movements in the North reached them, sometimes giving hope, sometimes fear, knowing that white planters would punish any hint of rebellion. Men and women whispered about freedom, teaching their children lessons about survival and courage. The plantation owners, meanwhile, debated laws to protect their property and maintain control. The system was built to ensure obedience and suppress any thought of resistance. The 1850s brought a series of laws and decisions that increased tension across the nation. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was one of the most notorious. It required that escaped enslaved people, even if they reached free states, be returned to their owners. Citizens were legally obliged to assist in capture, and penalties were severe for anyone helping escapees. This law terrorized both enslaved people and free black communities. Families lived in constant fear that relatives could be taken away. Abolitionists were outraged, while the South demanded strict enforcement. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 further inflamed tensions. It allowed new territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery, essentially overturning the Missouri Compromise that had limited the spread of slavery. Violence erupted as settlers and armed groups clashed in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Enslaved people and free black communities watched and sometimes participated in these conflicts, understanding that the outcome would affect their chances for freedom. Meanwhile, debates in Congress grew heated. Southern politicians defended slavery as a necessary institution, arguing that the economy and social order depended on it. Northern politicians increasingly saw slavery as a moral and political problem that threatened the nation's future. Every new law, court case, or political speech added fuel to the growing fire. Families of enslaved people felt the tension keenly, knowing that laws could dictate life or death, freedom or bondage. The Dr. Scott decision of 1857 shocked the nation. The Supreme Court ruled that black people, enslaved or free, could not be American citizens and had no right to sue in federal court. The decision also stated that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in new territories. This ruling outraged abolitionists, emboldened slaveholders, and deepened the divide between North and South. Enslaved people hearing of this decision realized that the law consistently denied them humanity, yet resistance and hope persisted. Escalating tensions led to violent clashes, and a sense that compromise was no longer possible. In the South, planters and politicians pushed for expansion of slavery into new territories. Enslaved people were transported to distant lands within the United States, further separating families and reinforcing the system. In the North, abolitionists and free black communities organized, protested, and helped escaped enslaved people via the Underground Railroad. Every act, law, or political decision carried immense consequences for human lives. On plantations, enslaved people continued to resist quietly. They sabotaged tools, slowed work, and maintained cultural traditions. Elders taught children about their history, survival skills, and strategies for escape. Women preserved families, nurtured children, and protected one another from abuse. Men plotted rebellion or looked for chances to flee. These acts of defiance persisted even as laws became harsher and the nation moved closer to war. By the late 1850s, sectionalism dominated politics. Southern states increasingly saw themselves as a separate world bound by slavery and culture. Northern states pushed back, denouncing the moral injustice of enslaved labor. Newspapers, speeches, and pamphlets spread opinions far and wide. Enslaved people, while largely excluded from formal political debates, were intimately affected by every argument, law, and policy. They understood that their lives were at the center of the nation's conflict, even if the nation refused to acknowledge it fully. Violence erupted in small and large ways. Slave rebellions, though rare, occurred. Escapes via the Underground Railroad increased. Communities formed networks to protect escapees and spread information. Every act of resistance reinforced the idea that freedom could not be denied forever. Yet the law armed men and the threat of punishment loomed constantly, reminding enslaved people of the risks involved. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 was a turning point. Lincoln and the Republican Party opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Southern leaders saw his victory as a direct threat to their way of life. States began to secede, starting with South Carolina in December 1860. Enslaved people on plantations watched these events with hope, fear, and uncertainty. They did not yet have freedom, but the cracks in the system offered glimpses of possibility. The road to civil war was paved with decades of laws, political battles, and cultural clashes. Slavery had been debated, defended, and attacked, but its human impact remained constant. Families were torn apart, women suffered sexual abuse, men endured forced labor, and children grew up in fear. Resistance continued in secret, as did the preservation of culture, stories, and hope. Every action, from rebellion to teaching children to read, challenged the system and prepared people for the moment when freedom might be achievable. By 1861, the nation was ready to erupt. The South seceded, the North mobilized, and the Civil War began. Enslaved people found themselves at the center of the conflict, as soldiers, laborers, and escapees. The struggle over slavery, which had dominated American life for centuries, was now entering its final violent phase. Families, communities, and individuals faced uncertainty, danger, and hope as the nation tore itself apart. The road to civil war revealed the deep contradictions of America. A nation that claimed to value liberty and equality depended on slavery for its wealth and culture. Laws, politics, and violence worked together to maintain oppression, but the human spirit persisted. Enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from subtle acts of defiance to escapes, from maintaining culture to sharing knowledge. The coming war would not only decide the fate of the nation, but determine whether freedom could finally be claimed by those who had endured generations of bondage. April 1861. Cannons roared, smoke filled the air, and America plunged into a conflict that would decide the fate of millions. The Civil War had begun, and enslaved people were caught in the middle. For centuries, their labor had built the wealth of the South, yet now the war presented an opportunity, however uncertain, for freedom. Men and women listened to the distant sound of battle with fear, hope, and determination. On plantations across the South, the absence of men who had gone to fight in the Confederate Army offered enslaved people rare opportunities. Fields were left untended, fences fell into disrepair, and for a few moments the rigid control of plantation owners loosened. Some seized these moments to escape to Union lines, hiding in forests, swamps, or sympathetic towns. Others resisted in smaller ways, slowing work, hiding tools, or helping others flee. Every act was a claim to humanity and freedom. The Union Army became a beacon of hope. Enslaved people risked their lives to reach it, knowing that freedom might lie just beyond the lines. Women carried children for miles, men guided groups through forests, and entire families planned daring escapes. Reaching Union lines did not always guarantee safety. Disease, hunger, and hostile locals were constant threats, but the possibility of freedom drove people forward. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were free. Though limited in its immediate effect, it did not free enslaved people in Union-controlled areas or the border states. It was a monumental shift. Enslaved men and women understood the power of this declaration. It became a signal that freedom was possible and that the Union Army could be a path toward it. Thousands of men joined the Union Army, serving as soldiers, laborers, cooks, and spies. They endured harsh conditions, prejudice, and danger, but their participation was a statement. They would fight for their own liberation. Women contributed too, guiding escapees to safety, tending the sick, and providing intelligence. Every act of involvement was a step toward reclaiming agency, dignity, and life. Life during the war was perilous. Enslaved people who remained on plantations faced retribution from owners who feared uprisings or escapes. Families were torn apart, often permanently, as people sought freedom or were forcibly moved. Yet even in these circumstances, acts of resistance continued. Stories spread of successful escapes, covert education, and sabotage. People relied on each other, preserving culture, faith, and hope. The Union Army also faced challenges in integrating formerly enslaved people into their ranks. Prejudice, unequal pay, and harsh conditions were common. Still, courage and determination triumphed. Black soldiers and laborers proved indispensable, showing skill, loyalty, and resilience under extreme pressure. Their contributions strengthened the Union effort and directly undermined the Confederacy. By 1865, the Confederate forces were weakening. The Emancipation Proclamation had encouraged tens of thousands of enslaved people to escape, depriving the South of labor. Union victories brought hope and tangible freedom closer. As the war drew to a close, enslaved people across the South began to act as though they were free, leaving plantations, reclaiming family members, and rebuilding their lives in small, careful steps. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, formally abolished slavery in the United States. This legal milestone transformed millions of lives. Freedom was no longer a distant dream, but a reality guaranteed by law. Yet the transition was far from easy. Enslaved people had to navigate a world still filled with prejudice, poverty, and danger. families fractured for generations began the long process of reunification. Communities and culture, preserved quietly through oppression, became essential for survival and rebuilding. The role of enslaved people during the Civil War cannot be overstated. They resisted bondage in countless ways, by escaping, joining the Union Army, sabotaging Confederate efforts, and maintaining cultural identity. Their actions weakened the Confederacy and strengthened the moral and practical case for emancipation. Without their courage, determination, and resilience, the path to freedom would have been much longer and bloodier. Women faced particular challenges during and after emancipation. They had endured sexual violence, forced labor, and separation from their families for generations. Now they confronted the task of rebuilding households, teaching children, and asserting autonomy in a society that still discriminated against them. Men similarly had to adjust to life as free individuals, often without land, resources, or formal education. Together, families and communities worked to reclaim dignity and autonomy, laying foundations for future generations. Education became a priority. Freed people sought literacy and knowledge as tools of empowerment. Schools were established, sometimes with assistance from northern missionaries or abolitionist organizations. Learning to read and write was not only practical, it was symbolic, a reclamation of power that had been denied for centuries. Communities gathered to share knowledge, preserve history, and ensure that future generations could continue the struggle for equality. Despite the joy of emancipation, challenges persisted. Economic dependence on former slaveholders, discriminatory laws, and social hostility shaped life in the post-war South. Black codes and later Jim Crow laws sought to maintain control over newly freed populations. Yet the courage, resilience, and determination shown during slavery and the Civil War continued to inspire resistance and adaptation. Communities leaned on culture, family, and faith to navigate these hardships. The end of slavery did not erase the trauma endured. Families had been torn apart, lives lost, and generations subjected to violence, rape, and forced labor. Psychological scars were deep, yet the human spirit endured. Songs, stories, and traditions passed down from Africa and maintained during slavery remained vital sources of identity and strength. These cultural threads connected freed people to their past and guided them toward the future. In cities, towns, and rural areas, freed people began to claim new opportunities. They sought land, education, and jobs. They formed churches, social organizations, and mutual aid societies. Every step toward independence was hard-won, often met with hostility or violence, but it was necessary for survival and dignity. The work of reconstruction would take decades, but the foundation laid by emancipated people was strong. The Civil War and emancipation reshaped America. Slavery, which had defined the social, economic, and political landscape for centuries, was legally abolished. Enslaved people who had endured unimaginable cruelty emerged as free citizens, ready to assert rights, preserve culture, and rebuild communities. Their resistance, courage, and contributions during the war had directly led to this historic transformation. Freedom was not the end, it was the beginning of a new struggle. Rebuilding families, communities, and economies while facing systemic racism and lingering prejudice would test the resolve of freed people. Yet the example of endurance, resistance, and courage during slavery and the Civil War provided a roadmap. They had survived unimaginable cruelty. Now they would strive to build a life defined by dignity, choice, and hope. The story of emancipation is not only about laws or battles, it is about the human spirit. It is about men, women, and children who endured, resisted, and maintained hope. It is about families who sought to reunite, communities who preserved culture, and individuals who claimed freedom despite overwhelming odds. The Civil War and the 13th Amendment marked the triumph of courage, resilience, and humanity over centuries of oppression. The guns fell silent, the smoke cleared, and a new America began to emerge. The Civil War had ended, slavery was abolished, and millions of formerly enslaved people faced the immense challenge of building lives in freedom. The joy of emancipation was immense, but it came with enormous uncertainty. Families had been torn apart, homes lost, and communities scattered. Freed people now had to navigate a society that was often hostile and uncertain about their place. During Reconstruction 1865-1877, the federal government attempted to rebuild the South and integrate freed people into society as full citizens. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to provide food, clothing, education, and legal assistance. Schools were built for black children, often under difficult conditions. Teachers, many from the North, came to help educate people who had been denied literacy for generations. Learning to read and write was revolutionary. It opened doors to political participation, economic opportunities, and a sense of personal empowerment. Freed people also sought to reunite families separated by slavery. Parents searched for children, husbands for wives, and siblings for one another. Newspapers carried lists of people seeking lost relatives. Letters were written, messages sent, and networks formed. The process was often slow and heartbreaking, but it was central to reclaiming humanity stolen for generations. Communities became centers of support, teaching skills, providing shelter, and preserving culture. During this time, African Americans made political gains, men voted, ran for office, and participated in local, state, and federal government. Black legislators helped pass laws protecting civil rights, public education, and land ownership. These were unprecedented achievements, showing that freed people were determined not only to survive but to shape the society around them. Yet Reconstruction faced fierce resistance. White supremacists formed groups like the Ku Klux Klan, using violence and intimidation to maintain control. Threats, beatings, and lynchings were common. Economic systems were manipulated to keep black people dependent on white landowners through sharecropping and tenant farming. These systems often replicated the inequalities of slavery, trapping people in cycles of poverty and labor exploitation. By 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, ending Reconstruction. This allowed Southern states to enact Jim Crow laws, enforcing racial segregation and restricting the rights of African Americans. Public facilities, schools, transportation, and even cemeteries were segregated. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and other barriers were used to deny black people the right to vote. These laws, enforced for decades, made freedom incomplete and kept the legacy of slavery alive in new forms. Life under Jim Crow was harsh. African Americans faced constant discrimination, violence, and economic hardship. Families often struggled to make a living, and children grew up in segregated schools with limited resources, yet communities endured. Churches, schools, and social organizations became centers of resilience, culture, and activism. Music, storytelling, and traditions preserved identity and history, offering hope for future generations. Resistance continued in these decades, though it took different forms than open rebellion. Leaders like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and many others worked tirelessly to improve education, fight injustice, and challenge discriminatory laws. The civil rights movement began to take shape, laying the groundwork for the major changes that would come nearly a century later. Every act of defiance, whether subtle or public, built on the courage and resilience of those who had endured slavery and Reconstruction. Economic inequality remained a significant challenge. Formerly enslaved people often lacked land, capital, and opportunities. Sharecropping kept many tied to the land and dependent on former slaveholders. Despite hard work, wages were low, debts accumulated, and families struggled to break free from cycles of poverty. Yet even in hardship, communities developed strategies for survival, mutual aid, and growth. Churches, cooperatives, and schools became lifelines, providing practical and emotional support. The cultural impact of slavery persisted as well. Music, religion, storytelling, and traditions adapted to the New World while preserving African roots. Spirituals, blues, gospel, and later jazz carried the history, pain, and hope of enslaved ancestors. Families passed down oral histories, ensuring that the experiences of slavery were not forgotten and that future generations could understand their roots. Even into the 20th and 21st centuries, the legacy of slavery has continued to shape society. Systemic racism, economic inequality, and social barriers can be traced back to centuries of exploitation and oppression. Yet the resilience and strength of African Americans persisted. Movements for civil rights, social justice, and equality led by countless courageous individuals have sought to dismantle these legacies and build a more just society. Education, activism, and community organization remain essential. Freed people and their descendants have fought for access to schools, jobs, voting rights, and public services. Stories of courage from slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow inspire ongoing efforts to claim justice and equality. The cultural contributions of African Americans' music, literature, art, and political thought reflect both the struggle and triumph over adversity. Families, once torn apart, became central to the fight for survival and progress. Parents and elders emphasized education, resilience, and moral guidance. Communities nurtured children, preserved traditions, and cultivated leadership. These strategies ensured that despite centuries of oppression, African Americans retained identity, dignity, and hope for the future. The story of slavery and its aftermath is not just about suffering, it is about survival, resistance, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Enslaved people survived unimaginable cruelty, fought for freedom, rebuilt lives during Reconstruction, and resisted oppression under Jim Crow. They preserved culture, nurtured families, and laid the groundwork for future generations to claim equality and justice. Even today, the effects of slavery are felt, but so is the legacy of courage and resilience. Communities continue to honor ancestors, educate youth, and advocate for justice. Monuments, museums, and literature keep the history alive, ensuring that the stories of those who endured and resisted are remembered. Freedom achieved through the Civil War and legal changes was only the beginning of a long journey, a journey that continues today. The story of slavery, emancipation, and its legacy is a story of endurance. Families survived separation, communities survived oppression, and culture survived attempts at erasure. Resistance, courage, and hope were never extinguished. These stories remind us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can survive, adapt, and claim freedom. They are a testament to strength, resilience, and the ongoing struggle for justice in America.